there, all you unbelievable ungulates. Welcome to another week of A Little Greener, a podcast all about nature, conservation, and sustainability. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Sara, and I'm joined by the unbelievable Casey. How's it going, Casey?
I am unbelievably tired right now. It's a miracle of life. But the last couple weeks of pregnancy are like just the next level of uncomfortable. So that's what I've been dealing with right now. What about you, Sara?
Well, we appreciate you being here for us. Like
Commitment.
Casey and I were just talking, and I was like, Casey, I would have stopped by now. So, I'm doing fine. Nothing major to report. I am a little bummed. I was going to go to a farmer's market over the weekend, but I ended up being kind of knocked out with a headache on one day, and then there was just a lot going on the next day. I just didn't feel like I could make it all the way out. I ended up taking my dog on a nice little walk instead, which was lovely.
That's a good start, yeah.
Yes. So I got some outdoor time in, yes, but I did not. I was going to try to get some, local produce since I've done absolutely nothing to progress growing my own so far. So now I just have no fruits or vegetables.
Oh, no.
But otherwise, I'm good.
There's always next week.
Always next week. That's right.
Well, Sara, last week you did a great episode on sort of the current status of rhinos internationally. And it really got me inspired to look at some of the ways that we're trying to protect rhinos. You mentioned poaching as being that swinging axe hovering over rhino populations worldwide. So I want to do a little bit of a look into some solutions that we have out there. But I wanted to ask you, because this kind of thought kept popping up, are you familiar with the phrase, the tragedy of the commons?
I was not until about 5 minutes before
we recorded
Google. I looked it up, and I think I probably have, teachers from my past are probably like screaming in my ear right now because I probably have been familiar with the concept. But so basically the idea that unregulated access to a shared resource is ultimately going to result in depletion and demise. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, basically. I was introduced to this concept my freshman year of college in an Intro to Environmental Studies Act. We played a game with M&Ms where there's this many M&Ms and they reproduce at a certain rate. Mm-hmm. But yes, the idea is basically when we have a common resource out there, but not like any sort of regulation on who gets to use it or how we're keeping it sustainable. Ultimately, we will be motivated by our own self-interest to deplete the resource.
We're selfish is what you're saying. Everybody's going to take what they quote unquote deserve.
Right, because I think it's kind of like what we talked about when we were talking about the Willow project, where the idea is if I don't pump the last barrel of oil, someone else is, and why should they get to do that? If I don't take this resource, someone else is, and why should they get to do it? Why are they better than me? And so, yes, the tragedy of the commons is that the common resource will go away if we use it without regulation. And that's what would happen if we just let rhinos be unprotected and let demand sort of figure itself out and trade in the horn. Mm-hmm. Is ultimately we would see the end of rhinos. And so I wanted to see if you were familiar, because it's a very niche environmental term basically. But thanks for helping me with a little definition here. And we're going to dive in just a moment. All right, guys, we are back with the main portion of our episode. Sara, let's get us started out a little bit. What is the state of rhinos worldwide? Where are we at with rhinos?
It's not great. We talked last week. We went through our 5 species, and the best one that we have in terms of IUCN classification is near threatened. I'm already forgetting. That's
correct.
Our white rhinos are near threatened, right? And we have other species of rhino that are critically endangered, including our Sumatran rhinos, my personal favorite, that have an estimated population of less than 50 right now. severely critically endangered, if I may create a new IUCN category.
It's bad. It is not good out there. All of the world's species of rhinos are threatened by poaching, specifically for their horns. That is the main reason. Even though these are really big animals, like they're not primarily hunted for their meat, for example. It is the horns on their faces that they're hunted for. Estimating the worth of rhino horn varies because it's generally illegal to trade it. So you have to kind of guesstimate. The most common number I saw is that it is worth about $60,000 a kilo.
Yes, that was what I was seeing the other week as well.
Yes, which is comparable or more expensive than gold or cocaine by weight, which are the two things it was compared to frequently. Some of the estimations were a little bit lower. Some have appreciated based on inflation up to over 70,000 a kilo. So it's not 100% clear. You can't go on Amazon and buy rhino horn and see what the fair market price is for it. As you mentioned, Sarah, protection from poaching costs a lot of money and requires constant vigilance. And there has been increases in funding for protection for rhinos over time. However, we're not seeing a decrease in poaching over time. We've actually, in the last couple years, seen a general increase or maintaining level of poaching, specifically with white rhinos, who have the largest population left. Protection also has a little bit of a ethical quandary going on there because you're typically protecting them with lethal force, like you're having basically a militaristic guard out there. And it can further a colonial dynamic within their range countries where the conservation organizations and governments are in a dispute with oftentimes people of the underclass who are trying to make money off of this, and puts them in violent conflict over this resource. And so that's something I've seen cited that I cannot speak super deeply on, but I felt like it was worth mentioning.
It is worth mentioning because I've never really thought about it like that before, although certainly the militaristic aspect is there. I mean, these are dedicated, guarded, armed units. Like, these are people who are out there with guns to specifically be on the lookout for poachers, basically. So there is, it's a pretty intense thing and an intense feel. I do think at least sometimes, and I don't know if this is a thing that has changed over time or not, and maybe it should be a bigger focus, is that there is, I think, oftentimes education associated with this where, okay, we do have these armed units, but part of their role we want to be to go out and be a part of the community and educate people and come from the community as well.
Yes, I mean, former poachers have been employed then as enforcement, and they're the ones who know the routes best. They're the ones who understand the strategies for poaching the animals best. But it does kind of speak to what the motivation is for poaching in the first place on that ground level in those range countries, which is generally economic instability.
Yeah.
So if we can't address that issue and we're going towards this kind of violent approach, you end up with these continuing dynamics.
Absolutely.
So lots of stuff going on there. Selling rhino horn is internationally illegal under CITES. So that's the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. It became illegal, I think, in 1993. And it's Appendix 1 for most species, which is like very, very strict regulation. And Appendix 2 for the white rhino, which allows the trade of live animals and some trophy hunting. Punishments include fines and imprisonment in countries like South Africa. So there are consequences outside of just like being caught immediately while you're trying to poach the rhino. If you get caught with rhino horn, you can get charged with illegal possession of illicit wildlife parts. So with this continued poaching, despite all of these resources going into it, despite all of these laws, we still have several species of rhino, arguably all species of rhino, that might go extinct within the next couple decades. So our current approach arguably isn't working to the extent that we need it to. But what are our other options? And so today I wanted to go into what specifically one of those other options is: rhino farming. So Sarah, I wanted to get your initial reaction when I say farming rhinos. How do you feel? What do you think of?
we've talked about this before. I think for me, it's just incongruous. Like, we don't farm rhinos. Rhinos are not a domesticated species, first of all. So there's already a difference. When I think farms, I think horses and cattle and pigs and sheep, all of which are domesticated animals. And the rhino is very much a wild animal. And so to me, it's already, and I know we do fish farming and things like that, but to me, there's already a separation in my brain. Secondly, it just feels wrong to me. We're going to talk about the potential pros of this, and I know that they exist, but the immediate feeling in my body is it's wrong. These are endangered species. We need to be protecting them in the wild, not worrying about how we can give ourselves access to this resource.
I think there's like an initial ick factor for sure from like my gut reaction is like, but can't we just not kill them? And why does this have to be an option out there? But our whole like, let's establish protected areas for them and try and put money into making sure that they can breed and protect them from their threats is already sort of the approach that we're taking, along with changing attitudes within the demand circle, which we'll talk about as well. And it's not doing exactly the extent that what we need it to do. And it's a huge, it's not a money pit, but it is a huge sink of conservation funds. And so we're going to talk a little bit about rhino farming and what the argument is for it, and then what the argument is against it as well, outside of our initial gut reaction, which is yuck. At least for me. So only the southern white rhino population is large enough that farming can really be an option. We've talked about like the Sumatran rhino. We're just trying to get them to breed at all and not being super successful. But southern white rhinos have successfully reproduced in human care in a zoo setting and also in a farm setting for a long time. They are relatively social, as you talked about before. So they would react better in like a natural history standpoint to being housed in slightly closer quarters. Not saying in like a factory farm situation, but like in a social situation than some of the other rhino species. 80% of white rhinos live in South Africa. And that is also the place where they are poached the most, both from public areas and from private ranches that own a bunch of rhinos. So that brings us to John Hume, who I found out about a couple years ago in about 2017 because he was making the news more. And John Hume is a rhino farmer. He is a former hotel mogul. So he is like independently wealthy. He's a South African. And he bought his first rhino, I believe, in 1993 and started a project called the Platinum Rhino Project. And it is a 21,000 acre breeding ranch that opened in 2009. He now owns 2,000 white rhinos.
I can't even comprehend that. Keeping 2,000 rhinos.
2,000. It's a lot. NPR said that's 13 to 15% of the world's total white rhino
that's
population.
Ridiculous. I just immediately have a problem with that.
It is amazing. Like, we imagine when we talk about endangered species populations of like them living out in like a national park or some sort of like uncontacted wild range. Nope. Like 15% of them live on this guy's property.
Well, and Casey, we mentioned last week, and I didn't dive into this side of the topic, but I did come across that piece of information that there were probably a high percentage of rhinos on private lands, but I had sort of just come across it, and whatever I was reading had made the comment that not everywhere can you privately own rhinos. So in some places you might have rhinos on your land, but they're not actually your rhinos. But some places you can.
And based on rhinos. All of these articles, he owns these rhinos. And he genuinely like puts a lot of resources into these rhinos. These aren't just like rhinos that happen to live on his land. They have a stud book. So they breed them intentionally. They try and pair up animals, make sure to keep track of their genetics. They have vet care. So they have a whole staff of vets. And the ranch has about 200 baby rhinos a year, which was his initial goal. Yeah. And he's successfully breeding these rhinos. His goal has been to create a sustainable alternative to current conservation methods by sustainably harvesting the horn that, as we talked about, regrows. And you can, his argument, if you take all of this as his face value, his argument is that you can fund the conservation of rhinos. You can do it by just funding, being able to make this farm financially sustainable and donating some of those funds towards protecting them on natural lands. And you can undercut the black market trade, taking down the price and therefore creating a sustainable, legal, and ethical market, because these horns are harvested without killing the rhino and allowing them to regrow, making it a renewable resource.
Thought number one is that, so he's talking about undercutting the black market, and this is an area where I probably just don't have enough economic knowledge, but to me that it feels very much like what we mentioned last week about this idea of flooding the market with synthetic rhino horn.
Mm-hmm.
And people can't even agree on whether or not that's a good idea for a couple of reasons, but one of them is that we don't know what that will do to the market.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what increasing the amount of rhino horn on the market will actually do. And some people think that that would actually drive up the demand of horn, which would cyclically lead to an increase in poaching. So that's one thought, is I'm not necessarily seeing where this is any different than that.
I'm just absorbing them. We're going to talk more about that in general. Yep.
Perfect. Great. Now I talked about that and I don't remember what my other thoughts were. So keep going and maybe they'll come back to me.
Okay. So at the time that his project opened in 2009, same year, in response to a dramatic increase in poaching. So in 2009, I think it was 2007 is when they really saw the spike of poaching start. 2009, South Africa said, all right, that's it. We're not going to allow you to trade rhino horn domestically. So it was already internationally illegal, but domestically it was legal in South Africa up until 2009, when this man bought a bunch of rhinos and they said, nope, you can't sell it anymore, which basically stranded Mr. Hume and other private ranchers who owned rhinos, and they began to stockpile the horn because they were allowed to own it because they own these rhinos, but they were not allowed to sell it to anyone. In 2015, Hume and Johan Kruger sued the South African government, claiming that it was their basically constitutional right to be able to sell a renewable resource. I think there was also sort of a procedural claim as well, that this ban really was enacted too quickly, without public comment, without that sort of stuff. And it was struck down around that time, but the government appealed it up until 2017, when officially the domestic ban on trading rhino horn was lifted. So 2017, it became legal to sell rhino horn within South Africa. You cannot sell it across international borders due to CITES, but you can sell it within the country.
Which is not where the demand is.
Mm-hmm. So this was all sort of around Hume also holding a private auction for about 500 kilos of rhino horn. He has a lot more than that. I think he had like 6 tons at the time, a lot of rhino horn, but he set up a private auction. Details of the auction were not disclosed. There's a lot of you had to pay a certain amount to get information about the lot sizes and what was actually being sold. But he claimed that you had to have a permit under South African law, and therefore you had to be from South Africa to participate. However, Save the Rhino, which is one organization that I will note is against legalizing the trade, noted that the auction website had Vietnamese and Mandarin language translation options, which suggested, as you said, Sarah, that the market that he's aiming for is not domestic, because there is not really a demand for rhino horn in South Africa. It is mainly in Vietnam and China. And so this auction, having these translation elements, suggested that it was opening it to, it wasn't you can get how Google will translate your webpage in every language. That's apparently not what we're talking about. We're talking about they constructed the website so that people in outside of the range countries could access the information, even if they're not the direct purchaser. And the auction, according to Hume, had lower bids and fewer bidders than expected, which they blame on the government's delay in authorizing the legal selling of the horn and like some of the controversy surrounding the opening up of the auction in the first place. So they sort of blame the South African government's reluctance to make this like an acceptable form of trade. He has estimates he's invested over $150 million of his own money to feed, give proper vet care, and protect the rhinos with protection services, because he's basically got his own armed guard, and his herds do get poached. They do get targeted as a source of illegal rhino horn. He said it requires about $170,000 per month just to protect them. So it's very expensive. And as rhinos become more scarce in the wild, private ranchers are becoming increasingly targeted by poachers because that's where they're available. So I think it was announced in February, but as of April, Hume's farm is for sale for $10 million. He claims he's basically exhausted all of his resources, that the farm is not financially viable because of legal restrictions on his ability to trade out the rhino horn in the way that he would like it to. And so he's not able to financially sustain the project, and he hopes that a wealthy conservationist will step in and continue to fulfill his vision, protect the rhinos, but be able to eventually make this a viable conservation method by making it a profitable venture. And some of the things that he's brought up, these aren't exact quotes because it was on a video and I wasn't typing fast enough, is basically, why can you shear a sheep and sell the wool and not cut off the rhino's horn and sell that horn while you're keeping the rhino alive? And the problem is that we've made the rhinos more valuable dead than alive.
It's an impactful quote, right? Or estimation of a quote. But I don't, like I said before, it's not apples to apples exactly. They're different animals. There's differences in our ability to properly care for them. I mean, I would love to see this place. I would love to see the setup that he's got going on, how it's done, what the dehorning process looks like.
You can watch videos of that. I will say, if you're interested, go on YouTube.
I will be, for sure. Because I wonder about those things. I mean, I've sheared a sheep before, and you sit them down and you shear them and you let them go. And, I wonder about welfare aspects of it. But he does make you think with the second part of that quote that we have made them more valuable dead than alive. And I do think that is part of it that would need to be addressed with this too, because I do remember reading some things from last week that wild rhino horn is just often thought of as better sometimes, whether it's by folks who are taking it for traditional medicine or using it for ornamental purposes. And again, I don't know the ins and outs of how the black market trade for rhino horn works, so I don't know how they're knowing these things or what they're being told, but that if farmed rhino horn were to become a thing, people might still be wanting to pay more for wild horn in comparison.
I think I didn't come across that argument in this particular context. I have come across that in big cat body parts, because there are such things as tiger and lion farms where they'll trade bones. And I've heard that argument that like people don't really want the farmed ones. They would prefer the wild ones. In the context of the research here, we'll talk about it in a little bit, I did not find that as a concern. And it might just be because we don't have a really good understanding of specifically like what all the drivers are of this market, because it's illegal. It's a lot of speculation on things. What I definitely, the thought, the quote here really jogged my thoughts. I think partially because, yes, you're right, they're not domesticated, but domestication is a spectrum. Like there's, when does an animal get to be domesticated, and how do we think about domesticated animals versus wild animals, what they deserve, what sort of protections they get, what their inherent value is. I think about that sometimes with like farms versus bushmeat versus like, hunting. There's a lot of ways to think about the spectrums of how our attitudes culturally impact how we think wildlife and domestic life should be treated.
Well, I think for me, the only reason I bring up the domestication thing is the welfare component.
And that's certainly an issue.
Where being less accustomed to people, whereas... But I mean, I guess I've been on, beef cattle farms where, you put them in the chute, and if you didn't, you wouldn't be doing anything with them if you didn't have that chute. So
right. And we just talked about last week how rhinos like scratches. So like there are certain animals who have habituated, not domesticated, but habituated.
Yes, and that's part of the reason why I would want to see what he's got going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So this poses an interesting question to me. Should we legalize the trade of captive bred sourced rhino horn? We are not talking about wild rhinos. We are not talking about the tragedy of the common situation where we should just blanket legalize it and it'll work itself out. It has implications for wild rhinos, but we're talking about a regulated trade, which has been proposed by South Africa. It's been proposed by Zimbabwe and China and lots of places to try and figure out this poaching issue. So I wanted to dive into the arguments for and against it with some examples from studies and other wildlife and things like that. So this is not just like a speculative entirely argument. I wanted to use some data from the real world because I wasn't sure at the end of the day before doing this episode how much I could argue on either side because I didn't feel like I just had my gut feeling that I didn't like it. And so I wanted to see what the implications might be. So obviously for John Hume, the unspoken part of this is that this man is a rich man who would like to probably stay rich. And so like, I think that should just be spoken out loud is that he might have a heart of gold as a conservationist, but this is also a way for him to make his investment financially sustainable. This is sort of the argument within it though, is that like, how do we harness capitalism to be on our side for wildlife protection? So arguments for legalizing the trade. Sarah, why would we legalize the trade? You've mentioned regulated trade as driving down prices, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's the thought or the idea behind this is the supply and demand issue. So if we are increasing the supply high enough, then we're going to drive down prices. If there's an overabundance of supply for what the demand is, then we're going to drive down prices.
Yeah, basic econ 101, right? Like you got those two little lines.
Graphs, yeah. That's about all I remember from econ.
Me too. So yeah, let's look into this argument a little bit. There is a case that this argument worked for. Because to me, it was very speculative. And it continues to be speculative. But as far as an example of wildlife being farmed to decrease poaching, there is a successful example, and that is crocodiles.
Yeah.
So internationally, crocodilian populations were decimated due to trade for their skins. And when in the 1960s and 70s, those populations were down very, very low. And CITES again comes in and says, you can't trade them internationally. We got to protect them. There started to be farming for crocodiles. And while trade is regulated under CITES and poaching is illegal, there are now legal breeding operations worldwide for lots of different species of crocodilian. And these legal breeding operations export from 30 countries. It's like 150 million skins a year or something like that. And all skins are numbered and regulated and have to have like appropriate paperwork to get through the system. And what we've seen is that there has been a rebound in crocodilian populations because poaching is not as big of a threat to them anymore.
Yeah. And it's a good point because I know all of this to be true. And while I don't still sort of love the idea behind it, like it's not one of my favorite things to talk about, there's less of that ick factor because it's been this way, as long as I've known it.
Okay,
like this has been in existence, I think, whereas it just does not feel normal to me to farm a rhino. And I think that because it's not a normal thing, I don't want it to come to a place where we need to make it a normal thing, I guess.
So you don't feel like crocodilian farming should be normalized either. You just
well,
feel
I'm
like
just
it's
saying,
to
I
the
think
point.
it already is, like, it
Right.
is. And so you're not seeing me out here railing against it because I know that it's happened and I know that it's had positive outcomes.
Right.
So whether or not I like that it exists, I can't argue against that outcome.
Yeah. I was on the crocodilian specialist group for the IUCN's website. Lots of good things in the show notes today because we're not experts and we're not trying to source everything there. But they talked about, there were some welfare concerns for the farmers because the skin is the most important part of the animal, that they have to make sure that they have good enough conditions that they're not getting in like a bunch of abrasions on their belly, which is the very most valuable part of the skin. They have to try and skew towards species that are more social. Like the Siamese crocodile is a better farmed species than the saltwater crocodile because they are less territorial. And so there's obviously some trial and error, even though saltwater crocodiles apparently have some of the most valuable skin because they're big and less bony. The farmers have some incentive to protect the parts that they like. The byproduct of the industry is meat, which is also exported into places like China as well. And at the end of the day, they have saved crocodilian populations in lots of parts of the world. So as much as the ick factor goes,
right,
it worked.
Exactly. So I think that that's good data to have. The caveat here is that this is not, it's once again, it's not an exact 1-for-1. The exact drivers of the rhino horn trade are going to be different. The way that this works is going to be different. So you can't be like, oh, this worked for crocodilians, we absolutely need to do this for rhinos. That's not necessarily the case, but it is good evidence to have.
Yes, and we'll talk about maybe some issues with that in a moment. Another argument is that the people who currently benefit from poaching rhinos, like there is a supply chain. The person who is killing the rhino is not the person making $60,000 per kilo of rhino horn. They're the ones hunting it. They're generally getting it to someone who's a middleman who's getting it out of the country. That might get it to another middleman who's getting it into a different country, who's getting it to someone who's selling it. And as it goes through that supply chain, the price is increased. So the person who is initially hunting that rhino and just trying to feed their family, it's not the only person making money off of that rhino horn. And lots of criminal organizations, terrorist organizations also make money off of it. So a lot of the more organized parts of the poaching industry, I guess for lack of a better word, network, can be connected to people who are also doing things like trafficking firearms and humans and drugs and supporting terrorism. So terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab and the Lord's Resistance Army in Africa have both been shown to be making money off of things like the rhino trade and the elephant trade. So yeah, those are definitely places that if you can undercut them by having some sort of way to take away income from them, yeah, it would be better to have that going through legal and more ethical hands. Because again, the argument is that if you farm them, unlike the crocodiles, which you have to kill for their skins, the rhinos should theoretically be staying alive. Right. They're not getting killed. And the quote unquote bad people aren't making the money. It's the people keeping them alive that would be making the money from them. And theoretically, you could use that money as part, maybe a tax or something on the trade to then fund the protection of those rhinos in wild places. That's basically all I could think of for arguments about why we should legalize the trade, and based on the articles I could find.
And I mean, I don't think you need much more than that. I think that that is the argument that makes the most sense. Like, if this is going to be a thing that happens, that's exactly why. It just brings up a lot of questions to me about how exactly it would work. And as we mentioned, this one individual, Hume, is that how you say his last name?
Hume, I think so, yeah.
It was a very wealthy individual. So my question is, how does this even become an industry? In part, if where are people getting all this money to start their rhino farms, first of all?
That's a great question, because I mean, that's something that's brought up frequently in the legalization of marijuana in the United States. So another illegal product that has mostly just gone through it's going to happen anyway through a legal lens. So why don't we have a legal way to do it, and we'll tax it and we'll make things better? But who, in the places where they've made it legal, have mostly benefited from it? People who already had the big resources to invest in like large scale marijuana farms versus people who in the first place, like in this case, it would be the people maybe poaching the rhinos in the first place, are not necessarily going to be the ones then employed by the rhino industry. They're still going to suffer on the penal end versus benefiting from the economic end. That's a great point that I didn't think about. So let's go into like the arguments against it overall. My first one is the one we've talked about already. Ick. I don't like the idea of I just wish we could all get along and we could live in a world where animals didn't have to die and that people could just live in harmony. And obviously this is not the world we live in. But the more relevant is the animal welfare of the individuals in the farming situation. From all the articles I could find, no one was criticizing Hume's animal welfare. Like no one was like, and he keeps rhinos in a crappy location. I don't know if they weren't doing that sort of level of research. They were more making the argument about his philosophy of the case, but that was never pointed out as like a major issue with how he was running his operation.
Sure. It would just be something that would have to be addressed.
Oh, absolutely.
For sure. If this became an industry, you know?
Absolutely. Because I was like, well, I mean, you seemed to claim at least to have very good intentions. Again, let's take you at face value. Let's say you seem to love rhinos and that's great. And you want them to have good lives and protect them out in the wild. Excellent. Not everyone getting into this industry would necessarily have those same priorities. And yes, you have good farmers. You have farmers who treat their animals poorly. How are we regulating this? But other arguments against is that we have actually done similar things with other illegal animal parts before. Specifically, it's compared often to the ivory trade. So legalizing a regulated ivory trade did not reduce poaching. We actually have an example of that. And elephants and rhinos are more comparable than elephants and rhinos and crocodiles. Yeah. Crocodiles can have like 20 plus eggs at a time, sometimes way more than that. Their life histories are more quick. We've talked about how rhinos only reproduce like one infant every 2 to 3 years. Elephants are more similar in that way, where they have long life histories with slow reproduction.
But also, I think the trade is more comparable, or some of the same drivers, I feel like, in terms of at least the sort of ornamental and sort of pride value, I guess, that these materials have.
Yes, but like, I mean, crocodile skins are a luxury item, which is kind of how you could classify these two. And that was sort of the idea. Basically, in 1999 and 2008, there was a legalized kind of one time at a time sale in China and Japan where they shipped out collected stockpiles of ivory from like deceased elephants, whether they were seized, poaching stuff, or just naturally collected from the bodies of naturally deceased elephants. They shipped them over there and they're like, okay, because this is, I can't say this is their reasoning, but my thought was, because this is not something we consume frequently, it's not like it's a food item, it's an ornamental value item, like you said. If we sell all of this legally, no elephants were killed in this particular sale of ivory, because they're already dead and have been dead. This should satisfy the demand within these countries and create its own little tiny ecosystem of legal ivory. And that should reduce demand and drive down prices for the black market of ivory that is going on in China. After those sales, there was after the sale in 2008, there was an increase in poaching of elephants in their range countries by 66%. And it attributed to the increased interest of people now seeing that ivory is an option, and the reduced stigma knowing that there is legal options for ivory after the legal sale. The US is the second largest market for black market ivory, so we are right up in that business right there. And basically they found that before it was like, oh, well, sure, maybe I'd like some ivory, but it's super illegal, and like, you know, I don't want to be a part of something illegal. And when they limitedly made parts of it legal, people are like, oh, you can have ivory now? Great. And it maybe didn't matter as much about whether or not it was illegal because there were legal ivory out there. And my understanding, and I wasn't able to find as much of this, is that the legal ivory trade gave some legitimate cover to illegal ivory trade because you could use paperwork from legal ivory to cover up for illegal ivory, and the distinguishing between those different items became very difficult for law enforcement. Several Southern African countries have proposed the legalization of ivory trade based on overpopulations of animals, which we talked about with like the black rhino in some areas. There's too many of them for that particular area. And for elephants, they can cause damage to humans and crops and things like that. So their argument was, this is a way for us to be able to sustainably manage our herds, which are too big. But population biologists have done studies based on the population dynamics of these herds and found that the amount of ivory you could sustainably produce from harvesting, and that means killing elephants or collecting the naturally deceased animals' bones, would not come anywhere close to meeting the actual demand for it. And so it would just, again, provide cover for illegal ivory. And that is an issue that you would see with rhinos as well, potentially. John Hume's argument is that it's a renewable resource, but you're starting to open up this demand, reduce the stigma again.
Yeah, I feel like my fear as I think this through, and I've got a lot of thoughts bouncing around, and so they're not all going to come out at the right time or coherently, I fear. But I think that the fear that I'm starting to develop in my mind as we talk about this, if rhino farming were to become a thing, is that we would eventually just end up with only farmed rhinos. Because I just don't see, unless we sufficiently also change attitudes and behaviors, which still needs to be part of this conversation regardless, we are not going to get to a point where we're able to keep enough demand. And if these rhino farms were funneling money into the better protection of their herds,
I think part of the argument is that they're also funneling money.
I know that that's the argument, but I'm just saying, if farming were to become legalized, they are going to need to make sure that their herds are protected. And so if it got to the point where farms were better protected than wild rhinos, I think that we'd ultimately still be seeing that decline in wild populations. It's just a fear that I have in my brain, and that is that this is of course not.
But we are seeing a decline in wild populations.
Sure, but I'm just saying, like, this is has become hypothetical in my brain, and I don't really have evidence to back that up.
Okay, well let's look a little bit at what the drivers are for rhino horn, because that's the end argument, is like, how do we reduce demand based on supply? And with the ivory trade, what we found is that increasing the supply actually increased the demand. There's an article from Mangabe in the show notes talking about how it is not the price of the luxury good that has impact on demand as much as the income of the end consumer. So I think about like diamonds. If diamonds were less expensive, I don't think we'd really want them that much less. I think more people would buy them because you'd be able to afford them more, right? That's how I feel about that, at least. So let's go into the two main reasons people use horn, which is traditional medicine and as a status symbol. And if we dive into the status symbol first, because again, that's kind of similar to elephant ivory and crocodile bags. Rhino horn is purchased as a symbol of status. One of the main countries cited within this is Vietnam, and it is either kept by the consumer or it is given as a gift. Typically, the people who are buying it tend to be wealthy and educated people. So these are not just like, I think sometimes as conservation educators, we lean on the lack of knowledge of people as being the reason they're doing it. These are very smart people who are very successful. They just have a cultural attachment to rhino horn as a symbol of status. So as there's been a rise in income for the middle class in Vietnam, that has been a cited reason for increase in demand for rhino horn and therefore the increase in poaching. This is supported by a survey done by traffic.org, which they talk to people in areas of Vietnam who either currently buy rhino horn and how they use it and who the demographic is. Again, oftentimes wealthy, successful, educated people. Oftentimes, like, I think they like quoted basically like maybe a typical buyer would be a successful businessman in his mid 40s, and he has a mistress and he's well educated, which I suppose might be another status symbol, because it is in a lot of countries to be able to support people outside of your family as well. This survey said that they found like that buyer, but they also found what they considered intended buyers, which is I would buy rhino horn if I could.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, like the person that is buying rhino horn is someone I would aspire to be. And if I had money, and when I get my money, that is what I will do. And so there is a market of people who, it's not like, well, if only we could just satisfy the people currently buying rhino horn with the legal of rhino horn. It's, we would satisfy the people who currently buy it, but we would also have to satisfy the people who would buy it if they could afford it. And more of them can afford it now. So that is sort of the status symbol element of it. Traditional medicine, I feel like, is the one we talk about more, though. And partially it's because I think that we have a little bit of bias in the US that this is something so far outside of our cultural practices that it seems like it's not a good reason for it. But again, as we talked about last week, we've got plenty of our own silly things.
Yeah, I actually think this is very comparable to some of the things that we do.
Honestly, like, more rooted in cultural tradition than lots of other things that we do as well. Like fads that we go through are much more fleeting than something that is this culturally ingrained. So absolutely something that is part of the culture over in Asia, and just as relevant as certain practices that we do for our health as well. So rhino horn under traditional Chinese medicine, and I have a article from a paper where basically they talked to a bunch of traditional Chinese medicine practicers from a bunch of different levels. So my understanding is mostly based on this paper, which I found really fascinating, that traditional Chinese medicine is practiced by people who are just like doing it from their house all the way up to hospitals in China. Mm-hmm. It is integrated with what we consider biomedicine, which they also call Western medicine. So same sort of things that we might see at the hospital is then integrated with certain aspects of traditional Chinese medicine as well. So it's just part of their healthcare system. Typically, rhino horn under traditional Chinese medicine is prescribed to treat many afflictions like acute infections to clarify the blood, viruses, and it includes treatments for SARS and COVID-19, for example. Now, in 1993, when they banned the international trade of rhino horn, China took rhino horn out of their like traditional Chinese medicine handbook protocol, basically, but it is still used to a certain extent in some areas. It is also used in Vietnam as well. Surveys done in Vietnam suggest that rhino horn is seen by at least part of the population as a potential cure for cancer. And this is a country where they might not have access to treatment as well as we do in the United States for cancer. And so if you're like, well, I can't get radiation, but I can get rhino horn, you're going to go with the rhino horn. The study that I looked at has a really they surveyed a bunch of these folks who participate in traditional Chinese medicine across different levels within the healthcare system. And they asked them what their attitudes were on the legalization of the horn trade, about what their attitudes are on like whether they thought it would increase the trade. I found the answers, and maybe if you dove into what they were individually, a little confusing, because they interviewed 84 people within the Guangdong region, which is, I guess, an area that they felt was most relevant based on being one of the largest by population size and income who might be able to afford rhino horn. The answers were super diverse. Almost half of the people were supportive of the existing ban, but also a majority of people were in favor of the proposals to legalize a regulated trade. And like based on the numbers that they gave, some of those people both were like, it's cool that it's banned, and it would be cool if they legalize the trade as well. So these are not like mutually exclusive groups of people. A majority of them, but not by a whole lot, thought that legalized trade would not increase the use of rhino horn. And their sort of argument was based on a proposal we'll talk about in a moment, but basically that there are only certain things they would prescribe rhino horn for anyway. And so there wouldn't be a huge amount of demand based on what you're already sort of integrating with biomedicine and other remedies as well.
So these are all interviews with people who administer medicine. These aren't these are not the
end consumers. Yes.
Yeah.
These are not the patients. These are like the medical staff.
Yeah.
But again, it seemed like it was across a variety of contexts. Like for here, you might interview someone who's like in a hospital versus a clinic versus a doula. Right. Like this seems to be across all those spectrums, from like very formalized to less formalized. Some of them said, hey, even like I'm in support of this ban because it also made us be more creative with what we use on other remedies, or I'm in support of this ban because even if it was legal, I think it's unethical to be able to administer rhino horn because of animal welfare issues. So this is not a like unified thought within this community of people who are administering the medicine. There's a good diversity of thought within that community of how rhino horn should be used and whether it should be used. And even within articles where you see like how it is used, you will see it attributed to a lot of different medical conditions that are not the same thing. And it seems to depend on region and beliefs and age group and things like that. So this is not a unified sort of thought process entirely. There seems to be if you read the article, it's super cool, but there's like a unified thought about what traditionally it's treated. And then there are some new thoughts from like the cultural perspective of what it might treat as well. But I mean, if your loved one's dying, you're going to try anything you can to help solve the issue. And if there's something that you think strongly will help, that is going to be a reason to go after something like rhino horn, even if you have conflicting opinions about it. But you brought up, Sarah, how do you regulate this? Like, how do we figure out who's taking care of these animals, but also like who gets to administer it? And China actually proposed legalizing domestic trade of horn within China as well.
This came up a lot last week, and I had to do a double take because there were a flood of articles that came out proclaiming that they had done it, but quickly to realize that, as I know you're about to say, that this was proposed and then quickly paused.
It was walked back real fast.
Yeah.
So China actually proposed the limited legalization of rhino horn trade domestically. You might be thinking, but China doesn't really have rhinos domestically, so how are they doing that? Basically, it was from, just like John Hume has a farm, proposed that captive animal farms, specifically not zoos. So this is not something that they're saying like, and we'll go to the zoos and we'll take their horns, like specifically captive rhino breeding ranches and things could supply ground rhino horn. So not something that you would then carve into a statue for a status symbol, specifically for traditional Chinese medicine, would have to be prescribed in a medical setting by qualified traditional Chinese medicine practitioners for specific conditions. So like this is a fairly narrow scope of how they would legalize farmed rhino horn. The proposal, as you mentioned, was quickly paused. There was huge public outcry from basically all major conservation organizations that have anything to do with rhinos. Were not pleased about this. Even when they did this study that I was talking about, the interviews happened right around when they legalized it for a hot second. And even the practitioners, a bunch of them hadn't even heard of it. So it wasn't like so well publicized that everybody knew about it, even though it was a relevant thing to a lot of their careers. But the ones when they asked specifically about it talked about questions behind, well, who qualifies as a qualified practitioner of Chinese traditional medicine? What conditions are they going to count as conditions you would treat with this? And even if they did, a lot of how severe those conditions might be, those people probably already are going to a hospital and using biomedicine to treat that condition versus waiting for, because of like it being so narrowly applied, going to a more localized source to get just the traditional medicine approach. So they had a lot of questions in there of how that was supposed to do it, and they weren't sure. It might increase demand, but based on these regulations, it seems super unclear about who's allowed to do this and where it's coming from and who's going to get it. So the argument remains in China, though, that legal or not, there's not a lot of good enforcement of current Chinese laws surrounding rhino horn or other illegal wildlife trade. So there's plenty of wildlife products that end up in China, and it seems like there's not necessarily either a complete awareness of what's legal or illegal, which we could say the same in the United States, but also that there's inconsistency in how the law is applied and the severity of the consequences of being caught with these things. So overall, there's not as much of a deterrent as you might think by making it illegal. Sarah, can you think of anything else that I missed within our arguments against category?
I think we've touched upon everything as we've gone along. I have feasibility issues for people being able to do this. I have regulation issues. I have uncertainty of success issues. And if we did this and then, I have concerns about what rolling it back would look like if it wasn't going to work. So I think it's just a lot of interconnected things. It's a complicated issue, but no, I feel like we hit on it at some point for the most part.
Having all these conservation organizations basically say we are against the domestic trade legally, right, both in the John Hume situation and in the China policy. I wanted to know what their alternatives were of what they were proposing, because we haven't saved the rhino. We put up so much money into saving the rhino. We haven't done it. And people are working so hard and making strides and made a lot of good strides for a long time, but we're still seeing the same threats loom over them. So what are they doing? A lot of this argument hinges on changing the demand by changing the price and accessibility of rhino horn to drive down the poaching. But current conservation organizations are trying to change demand by changing attitudes at the actual source of who is buying it. So we talked about last week, Yao Ming and Jackie Chan were part of awareness campaigns. I guess they did an awareness campaign where they had Chinese celebrities biting their nails and saying there's nothing in rhino horn that isn't in your fingernails, and try to do a social media campaign for it. Traffic.org is using a campaign called the Chi Initiative, where they try and frame success based on your hard work. You're not getting successful based on having rhino horn or other things outside of yourself. You are going to get there through hard work, and that is how you show this.
It's an appeal to the ego a little bit.
It's an appeal to the ego, but it also appeals to the values of those people, because what they found is that a lot of the people, when you're listen, you're killing rhinos, they'll say, poachers are killing rhinos, I'm just buying what's available to me. Or dinosaurs went extinct, so rhinos might go extinct. They live far away from me. Why do I care? And that is how they feel, whether you like those arguments or not. Arguing that rhinos are valuable because they exist on planet Earth with us, which might be an argument that Sara and I respond to, is not the argument that people buying rhino horn respond to. And so saying you value wealth, you value success, how do we appeal to that? And you're, achieving something on your own accord versus trying to frame it in an environmental context.
Right.
And one of the other studies that I looked at showed that people who are connected to nature tend to follow environmental laws more closely, which seems very logical, but is something studied. So they tried to measure these populations' connectedness to nature overall, and talking about that as a avenue for creating populations on Earth in general of people who care about the inherent value of nature, and that changing their attitude as well. So coming at it from what their values currently are, and also trying to change their values by connecting them to add this set of environmental consciousness as well. What we'll probably see happening continuously here is we will see rhinos continue to be poached. We will see continued protection for rhinos in the wild, with the same sort of methods as before. One of the things that they talked about as a general issue that could help is just being able to better enforce existing laws for people, making sure that like the punishments from them are very clear, they happen quickly basically, and match the crime that is committed. In a lot of the countries where they're consuming them, there's holes in this enforcement system which make that not a deterrence. But outside of that, we're also probably going to continue to see, we've seen some Southern African countries threaten to pull out of the CITES agreement altogether based on how strict the wildlife trade regulations are for species that specifically are found in their range countries and that they are having trouble regulating by themselves, both economically and population-wise. So I think this is going to be a continued discussion, and I don't think it's going to necessarily be a like, yes, we're going to all legalize farmed trade, but also we won't necessarily see a status quo in all of the countries that are impacted by this forever. That is my concluding thought on that.
Yeah. I think, there's compelling arguments. It's an interesting discussion. I think where my heart still ultimately lies after talking about all of this is I would rather see any resources that might be directed towards something like farming directed towards filling in those gaps of protection and enforcement, which I know is hard to do. And we're never going to get to I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where poaching disappears because we don't live in a perfect world. What I want to see happen is to get these animals past the point where it is that just constant threat looming over them, right? So I would love to see us close those gaps and solve the underlying problems that we talked about. Ultimately, that's what we as humanity need to do, is figure out how to be a better community and solve these underlying, economic issues that are driving people to participate in things like this. So I think, that's what I would like to see focused on, combined with these attitude and behavior change, certainly. But it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
I just think, I guess, to sort of wrap that up, is, to me, when we talk about things like farming and allowing for some trade, we are making it easier to do the thing that we don't want people to do. And I understand it's coming from a different supply, hopefully, and that's the idea behind it. But to me, ultimately, we're making it easier. And I just think if we make something easier, more people are going to want to do it. And so we're going to continue to increase that demand. And by making something harder to do, no, we're not going to stop everybody. But if we make it harder to do, fewer people are going to participate.
Yeah, I do think that the evidence against rhino legalization of farming is solid enough that I come down that is not the solution. I appreciate that there are a lot of different approaches to this. Mm-hmm. Basically, we have generally approached it from a like penal perspective of like punishment protection based. This is a proposal to attack it from an economic perspective. Mm-hmm. What I think that you and I ideally want to see is the human first perspective, which right. is addressing those issues that make this problem on both Absolutely. The poaching and consumption Purchasing, side go down. Which is, of course, the hardest long-term solution to this. I mean, the conservation organizations make a good point that like when you say like, well, some of it's legal, you basically just muddy all of your communication waters. And I think that that's their biggest issue from like what they're trying to accomplish from their own methods, let alone like what the population impacts are. And what we found from elephant legalization is they think it led to the deaths of about 100,000 elephants after that legal sale. And there are not 100,000 rhinos left. No. So we can't really afford to mess around with a lot of experimentation right now. Well, thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having this conversation with me. I learned a lot. So I hope you did too.
Thanks for putting all that together. It is a thorny issue, and it was good to walk through it.
All right, stick around and we'll be back with our conclusion for the episode. All right, it is our time for our challenge of the week. Every week, Sarah and I give you a challenge that you can participate related to the subject at hand. And as we talked about last week, not a lot of things that most of us are interacting with on a daily basis in this episode as far as like direct Rhino connection. But we touched a little bit upon the philosophical issues surrounding this and the cultural issues. And so two things I kind of wanted people to think about, and then one action that you can take. The first is to think about, reflect on yourself, and I want to think about this in the next week, is in what ways do I, myself, or my community show my wealth or invest in something that might have an environmental impact. So examples I've heard of before are things like BMWs, which might have a terrible gas mileage and are terrible for the environment, but is a sign of status. Diamonds, we spoke about, have their own both environmental and ethical issues. We have our own status symbols here in the United States that we can't divorce from the environment just because they're not specifically a wildlife product. So what is that for you? What is that for your community? What are you seeing? How do we think about that? Another is that we talked about connectedness to nature means that people are more likely to protect nature and follow nature-related laws. So how are we promoting a connectedness to nature within our own circles? And that's been a very big theme of A Little Greener, is how do we get connected to nature? So take your 15 minutes of your nature walk this week, 15 minutes a day, being outside, gets you connected to nature, makes you feel better, healthier, all of that. And maybe think about those things while you're out on it. If you want to learn more, traffic.org is a really great website. It's an organization that really looks at wildlife and plant life as well, trade across the world. They do a lot of initiatives for awareness raising. They do a lot of studies. So there's a lot of good information as far as learning more about how these systems work, because I just kind of hovered on the top. There's probably 20 resources in the show notes, and there could have been 100 more. So there's so much more to discuss when it comes to wildlife trafficking. And I hope this kind of gave you a little bit of a primer, and you can find the parts that you're interested in and maybe dive a little deeper. Traffic.org is a good place to kind of start for that.
Awesome. Thanks, Casey. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, suggestions for future episodes, you can find us all over the place. We are on Facebook at A Little Greener Podcast. We're on Instagram at A Little Greener Pod. We're on Twitter at A Greener Podcast. And you can email us at alittlegreenerpodcast@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye.